Good morning, everybody, and welcome back to Nextdoor NetAdmin. I've been working on my PXE deployment server this week, and largely what I've been doing is expanding its capabilities. I've discussed this a couple times in previous videos, setting up a server that will allow you to PXE boot new machines off the network, and then using Windows PE to deploy your installation images to those machines. None of that is changing. I haven't changed anything about that process. What I've done is looked at the number of customers we have, and while most of those new computers for our customers arrive at our office, and my PXE server is great for rolling out images to those, what if we have a need to image things on site for a particular customer, for any of our particular customers for that matter? There's no reason why I couldn't use the same process, but all of the installation files are at my office, and I can copy them back and forth, sure, but then manually keeping them all in sync is going to become really difficult really quickly. So I've expanded the capabilities of my PXE server by adding Syncthing. Now, I do have a demo server set up here. It's exactly the same installation process as I have demonstrated in previous videos. It's got dnsmasq for proxy DHCP and TFTP boot, and it's got Samba on it as well, so that I can actually access the file system from any Windows machine or from Windows PE when I boot into that, so that I can deploy the installation images. Syncthing is a tool that I've known about for a few years now. I never had a need to implement it. I knew what it could do. Syncthing, essentially, what it says right here on the screen, it's a continuous file sync program. And that synchronization by default goes both ways. In this case, I don't want it to go both ways. I want it to go one way only. I want to be able to replicate from my central repository at my office, and then from there, I want it to go out to these other sub-deployment servers at client sites. I'm going to show you how I've set it up to do that. So, yeah, syncthing.net. The installation instructions for Debian or Ubuntu are at apt.syncthing.net, and it's pretty simple. I happen to know that this directory, etc apt keyrings, already exists on my Ubuntu system. So it's as simple as going and downloading the GPG keyring for Syncthing, and then adding the stable channel. I'm not going to add the candidate channel, just the stable one. Thank you very much. To the system. Then I can do my sudo apt-get, apt-get update to pull those packages in. And then I can install Syncthing. Simple enough. Wasn't that easy? Linux is so wonderful for ease of installation if you have a package in existence for it. And if you can add a repo for it, so much the better. So that's the installation. Wonderful. Is it running? No, it's not. I'm going to show you how to get it running in just a moment. But before I do, if you look at the bottom section of this page, there's troubleshooting steps available where you can increase the priority or the preference of Syncthing's packages. If you need to, you can do that. The apt transport HTTPS package. Is that necessary? No, in this case it's not. It might be for some distributions, but I can confirm that Ubuntu does not have this package installed. But that's because the base apt package for Ubuntu does already include the HTTPS method. So the method driver is not missing, it's present even though the package isn't there. In Ubuntu 24.04 at least. As it says, it's depending on your distribution. So cool, fine. If you look at docs.syncthing.net, there's quite a few things under usage. Also, because I've got this on only half of the screen, it's got a different responsive layout. Usually this menu would be on the left-hand side of the screen, and it's not here. The first thing I'm actually going to look at is firewall setup, just because I'm going to point out that it's built into it that it'll try and use UPnP to get a working port. UPnP is universal plug and play. It's something that a lot of consumer level routers probably have built in and enabled. And if you're in the Mac world, the equivalent is NAT PMP, NAT pump, which is NAT port mapping protocol. But UPnP is not something that I enable in a corporate environment, mostly because as an administrator, I want to know what port forwards are there at all times. And I only want that to be a manual process. I do not need people randomly installing something on their computer and then it negotiates with the router and suddenly I have something that's got ports forwarded to it that I did not know about. That would be bad. So my routers do not support UPnP. And if they do, I turn it off. But port forwarding is pretty simple. It's 2 ports, one TCP, one UDP, and the communication works both ways. So I only need to set up port forwards for one device. That means I only need to actually forward the ports on my office router to my main central deployment server. I don't need to have a port open at every single customer site, which is good. That would be a lot more administrative work to have to deal with. Better to just have one port forwarded or 2 ports forwarded in one location, and we're good. You can do it without port forwarding. You might be able to do relay, but it's lower performing, and I've got quite a few files to synchronize in my deployment share, so I'd rather it have high performance than low performance. Local discovery, I'll cover that a little bit. Local discovery, Syncthing can announce its presence on a network so that people can connect to it. For various reasons, I am disabling local discovery on customer-side servers because I don't need people at the customer site trying to fiddle with that. I really don't. But that's the essence of the firewall setup. There's a lot of things in usage here: configuration, advanced configuration, folder types. I'm probably going to skip over most of this. But an important thing is starting Syncthing automatically. That would be really useful. And we're just going to jump down to Linux here. We're not using a desktop environment. We're not using Supervisor D. Ubuntu 24.04 is using Systemd, for better or for worse. And there's 2 primary options. You can set it up as a system service or a user service. System service is what I want here, because that makes sure that it's run at startup even if the Syncthing user has no active session. That's exactly what I want. I don't have to log into this server in order to start synchronization every single time. I want these to run as much as possible without my manual intervention. So it has service files, and the Ubuntu, Debian Ubuntu Syncthing repository that we just added ships these service files along with the Syncthing package. So these files are already there, but they're not enabled by default. You have to enable them because you have to choose which user account you're going to use to run the service. Best security protocol would probably be to create a dedicated Syncthing user. And if I was doing this for another purpose, I might do that. But administratively, I'm trying to keep this as simple as possible for this setup, which means I have a user account that is already set up with ownership of the directories in question. And that's the account that I want to use then to do the synchronization. Technically speaking, I have two accounts set up. The first account has read-write access for administratively adding or removing files. And then I have a read-only user that is set up so that when Windows PE connects, it can automatically pull down installation files, but doesn't have the access for somebody to go in and start pushing changes to the main installation share. Syncthing is going to need access to write to the files in that folder because it has to pull them down from my synchronization server, from my main deployment server in my office to the client side server. So in this case, if I set up a third user account, I'd have to make sure that all the permissions on the file system were set so that Syncthing could actually write to the file system. It's easier, in this case, for me to run Syncthing as the main user I'm using for administration anyway. So this is not me advocating that you should just run it as your primary user. Make sure you actually think this through and do what is best for the security in your specific environment. If you're synchronizing a whole bunch of different directories for a whole bunch of different services, it might be useful to have a dedicated Syncthing user. But for my purposes, it works perfectly well to use my main administrator account. So sudo system control enable Syncthing at ndna.service. ndna being the user of the admin user that I've created on this demonstration VM. I do that, great. It's been enabled. If I check the status on this, making sure to do the at ndna, you can see that it is now enabled. But it's not running right now. It's right there. Inactive, dead. Okay, so we'll do the second command right here and do sudo, whoopsie, I activated the wrong window. There we go. Sudo system control start. Thank you. Start Syncthing at ndna. I don't need to add the dot service on that, but you can. There we go. Now if I check status again, it is running. It has set itself up with a relay listener, a quick listener. It's got an HTTPS certificate, apparently, and the GUI and the API are listening on localhost port 8384. Localhost, only localhost. I happen to know that this particular server is at 192.168.17.22. If I tried going to 192.168.17.22, 8384, I'm going to get a whole lot of nothing. There's a reason for that. It's only listening on 127.0.0.1. It is not externally accessible. How do we do this? How do we fix this? Well, in this case, I'm not actually going to fix this. I'm going to leave it so that Syncthing is only accessible through localhost, which means that somebody has to actually log on to the server in order to administer Syncthing. I'm not opening it to the world. I'm not even opening it to the local network. I want Syncthing to be unavailable unless you're directly logged into the server. So how am I going to administer this? Well, in PuTTY, I'm going to go to Change Settings, and I'm going to go here to SSH. I'm going to go to Tunnels, and source port 8384 on my local host will be tunneled to localhost 8384. And I'm going to add that. Syncthing has instructions for doing this through the OpenSSH client on command line. This is how you do it in PuTTY. This port, the source port here, that can be any port number you want. The destination needs to be localhost 8384. You click apply. It doesn't look like you've done anything particular there, but if you check your event log, you can see that you now have local port 8384 forwarding to localhost 8384. Cool. What does that do? Well, if I do localhost 8384, there it is. We suddenly have a brand new GUI. It's not running on my local host, but when I go to my local host 8384, it's going through the SSH tunnel instead. Allow anonymous usage reporting, yes or no, as you wish. It says there is no username and password for this GUI authentication. If you want to prevent other users on the computer from accessing Syncthing, set up authentication. In this case, I'm not allowing this to be accessible from outside of the server, so it's only accessible if you're already logged on to the server, and the only user account that can do so is my administrative user. The read-only user doesn't have command line access and therefore cannot get this interface. So I'm just going to click OK. If I wanted to, I could go into settings. I can set the GUI authentication user password. I can set this up to be listening to the rest of the network. I can say use HTTPS for the GUI. It's a self-signed certificate, so you'll get that warning. Connections. This is where I can go in and disable local discovery if I want, so that it's not doing discovery on the local network. Ignored devices, ignored folders, API key. All of this is pretty basic. Most of the time, local discovery is the only thing that I'm going to disable. Global discovery is fine in this case because it's useful when the client end and the server end, both Syncthing instances are trying to find each other. A global discovery server is a good thing. It saves me having to manually configure IP addresses. Discovery on global is fine. I'm going to save that. Cool. By default, Syncthing has a default folder shared. I'm not really needing this default folder at this default location, so I typically just go in, edit, and then hit remove to get rid of the default folder. I don't need it. All right, but then I do add a folder. The folder label can be different on each device. What you call this, and I'm just going to call mine images, what you call it has no bearing on what the folder actually is. The folder path, in my case, because I put everything under SRV, I'm going to choose SRV images. That's what I wanted. That's where I want all of my deployment files to go. This folder ID is what actually identifies it as it's this folder or it's that folder. The folder path can be different. The folder label can be different. On my server, I could call it deployment and have it be at opt deployment. And then on the client end, it could be images, and it could be /serve/images instead of opt deployment. How does Syncthing know that this is the same folder on both ends? It has the same folder ID. So set that to whatever it should be. It must be the same on all cluster devices, and that's used to tie the folders together. Case sensitive, must match exactly. Okay. Sharing, I don't have any other devices added to this Syncthing instance yet. File versioning, there's options here. I'm going to go with no file versioning. Any file versioning I need will be at my server end. Ignore patterns. Do you want to add any? It can only be added after the folder is created. I'm going to come back to this. Advanced. Yes, I'm going to watch for changes. Scanning every hour to do a full rescan? Sure. Folder type, send and receive. By default, any changes on the client server, the customer server, would come back to the main deployment share, and I do not want that. So for the folder type, at my office, it's send only. On the customer side, on my customer sides, it's receive only. Files are pulled from the source, but any changes made locally will not be sent to other devices. Perfect. That's what I want. Random pull order is fine. Ignore permissions is useful on some particular systems or file systems. Sync ownership, send ownership, sync extended attributes, send extended attributes. I'm not going to touch any of that stuff for the most part. Ignore patterns. If you save it like this, then it'll start scanning and sending files immediately. If you want to add an ignore pattern, just tick that, hit save, and then you can add ignore patterns, one per line. I'm not going to go into all the details of ignore patterns, but for an example, I have multiple customer definitions. Do I want all of my customer definitions to go to every single customer? No, I really don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ignore the folder, which for me is called unattends, because that's where I keep my unattend.xml files. I'm going to ignore that entire folder and everything beneath it. Cool, but then how do I actually get the customer? Well, you have to put above what you're ignoring. I'm going to put do not ignore generic and do not ignore customer, the customer name in this case. If it's told first, do not ignore generic or the specific customer, then it will sync that folder even though the folder above it, unattends, is ignored. So this means that only that customer's particular deployment file and a generic anybody could have this unattend file will get synchronized to that customer. I can add customer 2, customer 3, customer 4. Those will not synchronize. And so that keeps that somewhat partitioned. Cool. Save that. Great. Now, this says that it's not shared, and that's true. So in order to actually complete the sharing, this needs to be done on both my side and the customer side. You go Actions, Show ID. There is a device identification. You can copy that. You can close it, and then you go on the other side of the connection. You would go Add Remote Device, add a device ID. This isn't going to work because this is this device, and so I can't add that as a remote device. And then you would call it a name, whatever name you wanted to just label it. So I'm not going to show you the entire process, but yeah, get this ID, take this ID, put it on the other server. Get the other server's ID, and add it here as a remote device. Once you do that on both ends, they will talk to each other. And you can auto accept if you want. I wouldn't. You can do, when you add it, you can select a folder that you specifically want to share with the device. I do that on the sending end and also on the receiving end. Once they know what folder they want to actually share, cool. And then it'll go through and it'll scan and it'll transmit to each other. On your actual file system, if I now ls LAH serve images, you'll notice that there's a .st folder and a .st ignore. These are also listed as hidden files when you're looking at them through SMB. The folder is there essentially as a sentinel folder. It tells Syncthing, yes, this is actually a folder that is managed by Syncthing. You can do your thing here. Okay. And then .st ignore has all of the ignore patterns that it's supposed to process. Those both are placed at the root of the folder that has been shared. You cannot put that lower down in the path. If you do, it won't be read and it won't have any effect. The stignore file will itself be ignored. And yeah, it's a little bit of a nuisance having it there, but you just ignore it. It's what's there, and it's hidden for a reason. The leading dot means it's hidden in Linux, and it has the attribute to ignore it to hide it, excuse me, in SMB as well. So there you go. And if we open up /192.168.17.22 images, there you go. You can see them, and you can see that they're both labeled hidden. Beautiful. So then I could add whatever I wanted in here. I can add a text file, call this test. Wonderful. This is still unshared. There's no information in this. This is a test. Okay, cool. So now if I save that, you can see that I've actually got some files there. And it's got local additions. It's got one item. It's roughly 0 bytes because I didn't put a whole lot in it. Cool. This folder is set to receive only, so any additions that I add will not go anywhere else. And that's basically it. I've added Syncthing. Yay! Hopefully this has been interesting for you. Maybe it's given you some ideas on how you could expand the functionality of your own PXE server. If you have any other thoughts on things that you would like to see me talk about or questions that you would like me to answer, feel free to let me know right down there in the comments section. Otherwise, thank you very much for watching. I am your next door NetAdmin, and we will see you next time.